You might want to grab a box of tissues for this episode of the Dr. Cliff Show. Hey guys, welcome back to the Dr. Cliff Show. I'm Cliff Olson, Doctor of Audiology and founder of Applied Hearing Solutions in Phoenix, Arizona. And I am joined today once again by a very special guest, Matt Hay, who is the author of Sountrack of Silence. Thank you so much for coming all the way out here from Indiana. What's it like at home right now?
Unseasonably warm. I think this is the first time I've ever gone from Indiana to Phoenix and gotten colder.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, it was a little chillier outside this morning. I went for a run. That's something that, having read your book, I know that running was something that you did regularly. I know that your wife, Nora, who we'll probably bring up a few times in our talk today, she actually got inspired to run a marathon and all of that as well. So it seems like running to some degree runs in your family too.
It does. I'm not particularly athletic, but I'm really good at putting one foot in front of another for a long time.
Well, there you go. That's all you need to do when it comes to running. So I really kind of want to share with the audience here who's been following me for a while, really how we met. Sure. And this was, and I don't remember if this was before COVID or after COVID. I'm thinking it was probably a little bit before COVID.
It was, because I remember that because I advised people not to launch a new product right before a global pandemic.
That's true. And so it was with Redux. And so we've had Redux now inside of our clinic. For those of you who don't know, Redux is essentially a way that we can dehydrate hearing aids and actually, or any devices really, ear-related devices, and make sure that we get 100% of the moisture out of them. It is probably saved thousands of hearing aids at this point from having to go back in for repair, for expensive repairs, because we can actually pull moisture-damaged hearing aids back out of the dead back into life, which is really cool. And that technology was really just being released for the commercial market at that time. And I know that you had reached out to me because you had this interesting product, and it actually saved you, and we'll get into that. Because that was really how you got into that company.
It was.
But you guys came out. You really wanted some honest feedback about how the Redux machine worked. I put it through a bunch of different validation testing on my own. They refined the product. You have since moved on from Redux onto a new venture, which we'll talk about here as well today.
Sure thing.
But honestly, when you came out with the book, I'm pretty sure I'm the one who reached out and was like, hey Matt, I would like you to send me a book because I'd like to read it. And this is really out of context for me because I typically don't read books like this. Okay. I am a research article nerd, so I'll read research articles like crazy. I will read self-help books. I will read books about business and all of that. But I typically won't read autobiographies that have been written. But given that I knew you beforehand, that you and me, we share a lot in terms of that we live in this world of hearing loss, whether it's from a provider standpoint or for someone who's experiencing hearing loss themselves to a significant degree. And I just was like, you know what? I need to step out of my comfort zone and read this book. And I fortunately had a recent trip that I also purchased the audio version of this book too, because there were portions where it made more sense for me in commuting and stuff like that to listen to the book. And I have to say that I may have gotten something in my eye a few times while reading it. I'm not a crier by any means, but I may have gotten something stuck in my eye. So I want to ask you, really, what was the inspiration for you writing this book and sharing this story about yourself on a very personal level?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your trust in dedicating the time to read that as a non-reader, to take a chance on that. I think at some point in our lives we all think, oh, hey, this would make for a good story. And so I had those racking up, and I would write as Christmas gifts to my kids a story about doing an Ironman, or a story about how their mom and I met. And I thought eventually maybe it would be something like that. But there's something a little bit egotistical almost to think, I've been pretty lucky in life, and does the world need to really hear about Matt from Indianapolis to a point that I want to write a book? But I have a rare disease called neurofibromatosis type 2, and I'm deaf without my implant. I've had 20 surgeries, and the book really gets into a lot of that. But when I got a little bit healthier, I went to my very first NF patient advocacy event. And I walked into a room in Illinois. Then McDonald's has a campus, and I walked into a room where they were hosting an event. Didn't make it past the card table and turned around to walk out.
Really?
Because I had just gotten through some really tough parts of my life, and I walked into that room and I saw a future of what could be, of people in wheelchairs, people who didn't have implants, that, a lot of like rudimentary captioning devices, because this would have been, 2004 or 2005, and I wasn't ready for that. I turned around to leave, and a mom there stepped in front of me and said, "Do you have NF, neurofibromatosis?" And she put her hand on the head of a boy, or her son that was with her, and I said, "Yeah, I have NF too." And she said, "I'm so glad you exist." And I thought,
man, that's heavy.
She wasn't saying she liked me. She might have disliked me. All she cared was that I existed, and I knew what she meant, that she didn't see a future for that little kid, but seeing me walk in with car keys and a book bag and signing my name tag, and what she needed to know that day was that her kid had a future, and I represented that. Regardless of who I was, I represented that, and I thought, I can't not do this. And that really put me on a path toward advocating for rare disease and advocating for patients. And so the book is really a representation of not just me, but maybe an experience that other people can relate to, whether it's rare disease or hearing loss or falling in love or listening to music. And so it's a very long answer to the inspiration, but I hope when you get done reading that, or while you're listening to that, you think, hey, that's cool, and then maybe never think about me again, because I want you to read that and think about, who are the people that have supported you in your life? What are the things that maybe you didn't do because you thought it was too hard? If it can help you 1/10% thinking through stuff like that, that's why the book's there.
Well, I'll tell you, the one thing that I really got from it was this aspect of gratitude, because, I think there are trials and tribulations that all of us go through, hearing loss or not, throughout life. And it really gives you perspective on how things are for other individuals who are struggling through their own, life's battles. And it puts you in this position of not necessarily feeling bad for you, because I don't think I ever really felt bad for you in the book, and I don't think you wanted us to feel bad for you in the book. I think it was more of a self perspective of how am I viewing the challenges that are coming across me in my daily life through anything. And I think it now makes me take a little bit of a step back and have a little bit more gratitude for my ability to overcome challenges in my own life. And so what I would say is that whether someone has hearing loss or not, this book is a very relevant book for all of us. If you are alive today, it is relevant, right? Now, let me ask you this. So there's a lot of people who are probably watching this, and they've gotten to this point and they're like, okay, neurofibromatosis 2, what the heck is that?
Sure.
So let's explain to them exactly what that is.
So the very brief, I'm not a physician, the brief overview is you have a gene. Most people have a gene that prevents tumors from growing on the protective sheath around nerves in your body. I lack that gene. I lack the gene that says, don't let tumors grow on the sheath around your nerves. For better or worse, we have 50 or 100 miles of nerves in our body, which means there's a lot of map for tumors to grow. For whatever reason, these tumors really like hearing nerves. So having bilateral acoustic neuromas, now an acoustic neuroma is not terribly uncommon. You get one on one side, and it's frustrating and difficult. If you have them on both sides, you're probably going to lose bilateral hearing loss. Even worse, when you have two tumors, and mine are just smaller than golf balls, growing on both sides of your brainstem, you start worrying about brainstem compression. I don't even know what brainstem compression really means, but I'm told it's as bad as it sounds. And so that was the diagnosis of NF2. I think the last radiology report, the radiologist used the word innumerable to describe tumors, which I thought was a little bit lazy. I thought, if I'm going to live with this, the least you can do is count them.
Yeah.
But I've had upwards of 20 surgeries to deal with this in brain and spine. But having said all of that, don't feel sorry for me for a second. What you said before is you didn't feel sorry for me. It made you reflect on your own life. That's exactly what I want to hear. I mean, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I just happen to have a debilitating rare disease.
Yeah. And I mentioned to you briefly before we started recording that my first and only exposure to someone with NF2 was someone who was 22 years old, African American kid. I shouldn't say kid, 22 years old. Seems like a kid now. But came into the clinic when I was doing my 4th year externship rotation. I tested his hearing, and his hearing had dropped significantly from the previous time that he had come in and had a test, and I want to say it was like 6 months prior he had come in for a test. And my preceptor at that time basically told me, I don't think that you understand how rare of a circumstance this is to actually see this and get to work with someone who has NF2. This individual had not had any surgeries or anything like that at this point, which I want to get into. So, when someone has a tumor growing on one of their auditory nerves, they typically will go in, they'll remove that tumor, and it will render them essentially deaf in that ear in most cases. Almost all cases. In that particular instance, they will typically opt to do either a bone-anchored hearing aid that will vibrate their skull, so it'll get implanted on the affected side, and it will transfer the sound from that side into their better hearing ear. Some individuals have completely normal hearing in that ear, and some people might have an additional hearing loss in that ear. Some individuals may opt to do something called cross or bicross, where they actually have a cross transmitter that looks like a hearing aid. It will send the sound from the affected side over to their better hearing ear that actually has a hearing aid in it, and either cross, which is they have no hearing loss in that better hearing ear, or bicross, which is where they have a hearing loss in that better hearing ear, and that sound needs to be amplified. I think that a lot of people, and you said yourself, like some people think, cochlear implant. And that's really not the solution, because if the nerve is damaged, so let's say, and in your case, they go and they remove the nerves, and it essentially renders you with no hearing whatsoever. The damage really is occurring along the nerve, because that tumor is growing along the myelin sheath of that nerve. And so when they pull the tumor out, you have no ability to transmit sound through that nerve anymore. And so a cochlear implant that's designed to bypass the cochlea, which is the hearing organ inside the ear that we all think of, that stimulates the nerve directly, but if your nerve cannot transmit that sound to the brain, a cochlear implant won't work.
And the analogy I use is if you've ever driven down a perfectly paved interstate, the crew just finished and it's smooth and the lines are freshly painted and it's well lit. My ears work fine. Like my actual ear canal and ear process is all totally fine, but at the very end of that perfectly paved highway, there's this rusty little bridge, and it got washed out in a storm. And that rusty little bridge is your nerve that connects that perfect highway to your brain, and I have no bridge.
And there's no way to get across it unless you have a way to completely bypass that damaged bridge, which is essentially what an auditory brainstem implant is, and which is what you have.
That's right.
So talk to us a little bit about the ABI and the process of going through the surgery and all of that for that.
I know there was just in the last couple of months some news about Elon Musk implanting a new device in a brain, and I remember reading that, and it was like big news on TV, and I thought, I've had one of those for 20 years. Wow, how is that new
Come
news?
on, Elon, get with the times, man.
So essentially, you're exactly right. They have to bypass everything. So I went to the House Ear Institute in Los Angeles, who at the time had done a couple of hundred of these. It had only been approved by the FDA for a few years at that point. And so I went to LA from Chicago at the time, and they take a tiny little fly swatter with about 12 electrodes on it. And this is really how they explain. They said, we attach it to the part of your brainstem that we think processes sound.
Oh my gosh.
So the surgery was...
There's a big difference between think and know.
We think. We think. So you're going to sew a fly swatter to my brainstem, and we think that's going to help. So they removed the tumor, and they said, great news, we got the tumor out, but there's a lot of really important things that happen right by your brainstem. And your hearing nerve is very close to your facial nerve, it's very close to your valence nerve, so when they remove that tumor, I woke up with no hearing. I woke up with facial paralysis and no balance or vestibular nerve function. And so it was a lot to deal with all at once. Then you have to wait 8 weeks for it to heal for them to turn I went back out to LA and they turned on my Brainstem implant. And the hope or the expectation management is that you would hear life noises, which is like oven timers or police sirens. But when you've been completely deaf, well, for a couple of months at that point, and I should add here, there's nothing wrong with being completely deaf. There are people that live and thrive and have wonderful life and culture. It was not my culture. So I was deaf with a little case D, not deaf, big case culture
Right.
D. So I was not living in my world. And so the idea of being able to hear any kind of sound to me was incredibly appealing. I mean, borderline romantic.
Yeah,
You wouldn't
yeah.
think of an oven timer as romantic.
Yeah,
but-
well.
And so they turned it on, and that is essentially what I heard. I mean, my whole world sounded like a gravel truck passing by. Somebody saying hello, the water faucet was all very muffled, but that's what they told me what to expect. And I learned to appreciate over time the sound of my wife's heels on hardwood floor, because I knew somebody was home. That was way better than a month prior, where she'd show up and scare the heck out of me.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe that's about as far as I would ever get with the implant. So that was 20 years ago. I'll fast forward a little bit and say that sometimes implants don't work at all. When they said, we think we know the part of your brainstem, the doctor was right, and he nailed that sucker, because all 12 of my electrodes work, which gave me flexibility and how to process that
Nice.
sound. You think a chord on a piano, if you find the right 3 or 4 notes, it sounds better. We've been able to do that. I get updating and mapping with my implant every year, and it gets marginally better. There's a lot more in the book about the role music played in doing that, and how really with the help of some of the music I listened to before my hearing loss, I was able to self-prescribe some therapy that helped. And I'm at a point now, and this is 20 years of daily rehab. I mentioned before I'm good at putting one foot in front of another. Same thing applies to getting used to a hearing aid or getting used to an implant, is just keep putting one foot in front of another. So fast forward that to 20 years, my open-aided sentence recognition, which is not a common test most of your patients would have, but it's essentially your ability to hear random sentences like, I dropped the napkin on the floor, can you pick it up? So context is not very helpful. I can get almost 96% speech recognition.
That's unbelievable. When I was reading through the book, and when I was reading through the section talking about what the expectations could be, I was like, oh my gosh, hear kitchen timers and, hear things like that. And then you had actually interacted with a gentleman who had an ABI implanted, and he actually said, don't do it.
Yeah. But I mean, this was really pre-internet. I mean, like Netscape Navigator. The first time I Googled I didn't Google it. Google didn't exist. The first time I Netscape Navigated neurofibromatosis type 2, I got one PDF file that was a decade old that told me my life expectancy was 31.
No kidding.
I was 23 at the time.
Oh, man.
And so I had to call the hospital, 1-800 number, and they replied back and had to get permission and gave me the phone number of somebody who offered to let me call him. So now I'm nearly deaf at the time, trying to call a guy, it was just, and we ended up working out on an early version of email, and he essentially said, yeah, it's not worth it, don't do it.
Really?
And I thought, I'm looking for just somebody to say, it's going to be okay, Matt. Like, it's just stop worrying about everything. Here's one thing that's going to be better. And the only person I had to help me with that said, don't.
So how long had this gentleman had the implant for by the time that you called him?
I don't know. We didn't get into the detail of his health. I figured early on, I think we all meet people in life and you're like, this is a person I need to surround myself with. I decided early on that maybe he wasn't someone I needed to surround myself with. But we're all dealing with our own things, and he maybe had a lot of other things he was managing at the time. I just know that nothing in the outcome that I've gotten, nothing can replace persistence.
Yeah.
And my hearing was just incredibly important to me, and there were times where it would get a little bit better and I would stop practicing. And it would get a little bit better and I'd be like, okay, well now I can do this, and I would stop practicing. We had newborn twins, and I think I mentioned this in the book. And they're crying one night, and I don't have my implant at night. So my wife elbows me, and I have to put my implant on and put glasses on. And 30 seconds later, as soon as I turn the implant on, there's just this cacophony of sound. And our newborn twins are in the next room bawling. And my wife's exhausted, as a lot of new moms are. And she's trying to tell me who needs what. And I remember laying there in that bed and thinking, one of my kids needs me. One of my kids is in hurt or hungry, and I can't tell who it is, and if my wife weren't here, I wouldn't have known that. And those are the kind of moments that I thought, I need to start putting this down on paper, because I want other people to know if they're feeling this way about something, they're not alone. And that was the motivation I needed to say, it's time to go back to work and get better at this implant, because where I am now is not okay with me.
So, given that my limited experience working with individuals who have NF2, but a good amount of experience working with individuals who have cochlear implants, I think that there's a lot of individuals who don't put in the work and they don't get the result that they were looking for because of it. I'm glad that you decided to get a auditory brainstem implant even after having that conversation, because I think it is, again, a testament to you have to put in work if you want to get results. Now, especially with the auditory brainstem implant, it seems that there's a lot of people who get a cochlear implant and then boom, automatically they can hear. People might sound like chipmunks for a week or something like that, but then their brain just naturally picks up on it. It's completely different. Like, the amount of work that you put in seemed borderline psychotic, almost like a Ironman triathlete.
They're maybe we're wired a little bit weird. I think that I'm accidentally programmed to live with this rare disease because I chalk it up to a level of irrational persistence. And you mentioned the cochlear implants, but I started out with an in the canal aid in college, and they got bigger and bigger. And even then, if I didn't work at it, or now working in patient advocacy, the longer I got to work with one hearing care provider, where my audiologist and I have worked together for 15 years. She's seen this in, I guess, maturity or growth of my ability to use my implant. And I think when I had that earlier with hearing aids, and the same thing, by being persistent and letting her know, this is what this thing sounds like, this is the problem that I'm having, to take a little bit of ownership of my own hearing, even with the tiny little in the canal aid, I got better outcomes. One of the reasons we talked about how you and I first met with Redux, one of the reasons I reached out to you is I very quickly thought, I really believe this guy is putting patient interests first. Yeah, he's got a YouTube channel and it might look like he's trying to draw in traffic, but if you take time to look at what you're doing, you're drawing in traffic to be able to share something you want patients to hear in a way you couldn't do just with ads in Arizona.
Absolutely.
It is a scalable way to say, this is the way I treat patients, and here's why. And if your own audiologist isn't doing the same thing, okay, maybe ask why. And to be able to take ownership and say, why, I'm not having a very good outcome with this new hearing aid, but I noticed we didn't do a real ear measurement here. Is there a reason why? Or I did a triathlon and I wore my implant and I dropped it in the water and it's not working. Is there a reason why? And I think that there's a level of advocacy there, in self-advocacy, of owning what the challenge that I'm having. Initially it was hearing aids and hearing aid batteries. Now it's just an extension of that, which is working with my implant. I will say, I've been at this a long time, and the book was pretty therapeutic of being able to say, okay, maybe I'm not where I want to be, but I'm a heck of a lot farther along than where I was when I started. That has really gotten me to a point where I want to take all of this stuff that I've learned, if I can share it with somebody else, or if you can read that and apply it to something in your life, and that makes it, maybe you have to make the same mistakes, but maybe you learn from them 1% faster than I did. We've talked before in the past about legacy.
Yeah.
And I'm too young to really be thinking about that. But if I could put something out in the world that makes somebody's life 1/2 of 1% better in a situation, that's pretty amazing.
I think it is important to think about legacy, even at our younger ages, relatively speaking, because I think it makes you make better decisions now that a lot of people just chalk up, oh, I was younger, so I was doing things for selfish reasons and stuff like that. I mean, thinking about legacy, I think, is important. Were you always this way? Take me back to your childhood. I mean, what was is this how you always were and how you perceived challenges?
My whole life I've been pretty driven by the concept of what would make for a good story at a party. I ran for class president because I got a parking spot, and that would make a good story at a party to be able to tell some girl that I met that I'm actually the class president. Because when you're 17, having a parking spot at a high school feels like a big deal. But I've always been driven by the idea of let's do something big that we can talk about and laugh about for the next decade. I did change a lot, though. I mean, my outlook on things, even sometimes my politics on things, because growing up, if I worked really hard at something, I usually got what I wanted. It doesn't mean it came easy, but I usually got what I wanted if I worked at it. And when I was diagnosed with NF and lost hearing and balance, ability to smile, ability to blink, was whatever moments where I thought I was being empathetic. Nah, that was sympathy. I felt sorry for you. I wasn't empathizing with you. And so those are skills that I developed because of my diagnosis and because of all the things that came along with that. And so it changed me a lot as a person. I think that I was always pretty persistent in things, but I had a much better appreciation of this is my journey. And this book is about my journey, and your journey is different, and that's totally okay. And there was a time in my life where if I felt like my journey was pretty good and you were doing it differently, you must be doing something wrong. And so the maturity that came with, sometimes we just get dealt really tough cards, and you do your best to work with those, and it makes you maybe a little bit less judgmental about how other people choose to play their cards. On one hand, it's too bad it took me until I was 22 or 25 to come up with that realization. On the other hand, how fortunate, and I wish I could have learned that without rare disease. I wish I could have learned that with great hearing. But that was the hand I had been dealt. And I'm looking back now at 47, I'm fortunate that I learned that lesson at 25 because it started shaping the things that I wanted to accomplish in life.
Yeah. Do you think about that young kid at that first meetup that you went to?
I do. And I actually work in advocacy now, and I have the opportunity to engage a lot with the NF community, and I really, nobody's ever asked me that question before, so I'm a little emotional thinking about it, but and maybe we can all relate to this of somebody that you just passed briefly in life and you think, I wish I could let you know how much you changed the trajectory of my life. We passed and had a 20-second conversation, and in my mind I could draw them. I could tell you exactly what they look like. I might be wrong, but in my mind they still exist in a very real way. And it's probably a good reminder to us all of when somebody does do something that is impactful or particularly supportive, why would you ever wait to tell them you did this for me? You didn't realize it, but you had that impact on me, and thank you. Another, I guess, I try to look at things with a positive spin. So I was about to say an advantage of living with a rare disease is I still have another brain tumor on this side, and a brain tumor in my spine. But when you live with that Acme anvil hanging over your head, you don't wait to do much.
Yeah.
Matt, you want to come to Phoenix? I'll be there Thursday.
Yeah.
I don't wait for much. I didn't think about writing a book anymore. I sat down and started writing a book.
Yeah.
And you can relate to that too. You've got about 14 different things going on any given day. I don't think you're a waiter to do things either.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's a lost opportunity, and we only are blessed with so much time on this planet, which is something that I just kept thinking about reading your book. I mean, I think that you've taken advantage of every minute that you possibly could have on this planet so far. But I would be remiss if I didn't go back and really talk about your family a little bit, because your family has had, especially, you talked more about your wife, obviously, because she really went through the majority of all of this with you. How important was it for you to have her in your life through this? I get that that's a very loaded and heavy question.
I can assure you this wasn't the intention, but it was a positive outcome. Is if you write your wife what is essentially a 272-page love letter, she's probably going to really appreciate that. And this kind of came out that way because when I was thinking about some of the really toughest parts, two themes that kept coming up were the music, like the soundtrack to that moment, which is not coincidence. The book references 128 different songs that I remember from different points in my life. So music, but then also Nora, and she didn't read the book until it was done. And so there's a lot of trust in letting somebody else tell some of the most
personal,
impactful, emotional. When we talk about losing our parents, we talk about struggles in our marriage, and it all came from my perspective, which is a pretty significant responsibility. And you could probably have an argument with your wife, and 5 minutes later, you both have totally different perspectives. I'm talking about some pretty substantial things about like the decision to have kids through IVF, and I'm sharing Nora's perspective 20 years later publicly. So she does not like to put herself out there in that way, so I will never be able to thank her for the trust of allowing me to do that, and I hope I did it justice. But I felt like the story of a caregiver needed to be told. And so rather than think about this for her, she's much more comfortable thinking about this instead of a book about Nora or all of the things that Nora did. It is all of the different ways that we rely on a support structure. And she was the beginning, middle, and end of my support structure for a long time. And even friends that I've had since kindergarten read the book and said, I had no idea. And really the only person that did was Nora, because she was the one that had to leave the room in the hospital when nurses carried me to the toilet. She was the one that was training for a marathon to raise money for the disease that put me in rehab 6 months after we started dating. She was the one that carried twins to term. She was, when our first son was born, he comes out a blonde-haired, blue-eyed looking kid. I was like looking at this tiny version of myself. And I come back over and say, we have a son. And she looked right back at me and said, I have to do that again. And, she just has been there through all of that. And I have a greater appreciation for that now. One of the more emotional things for me in writing the book is because I didn't realize it at the time. I was so caught up in my own stuff, like just trying to live, trying to wake up the next day, that when her own dad died unexpectedly, and I get into this a little bit in the book too, is I was so caught up in my own stuff that I didn't even realize how much I wasn't there for her. And when my dad died, and I saw the way just a couple of years ago, and I saw the things that she did, and just knowing how to be, and knowing when I needed something, and knowing when to back off, I had this realization that I tried to be a good and supportive husband, but I was completely oblivious to how much support I wasn't able to give her. And so that hit me pretty hard, because it started making me think of all the other times where I maybe was so wrapped up in my own stuff, I didn't take the time to acknowledge the support that the people around me were giving me. And again, I tell that story, and I hope you think Nora sounds awesome, and I hope you don't think about me anymore. I hope you immediately start thinking, who in my life do I need to call and thank, or who do I need to say, you know what, I really appreciate when you were there for that, because that's a lot more universal than a 1 in 40,000 rare disease with a guy that gets an implant you've never heard of until this episode.
For sure, for sure. I couldn't help but thinking about my wife Ashley reading this book when you're talking about Nora, because I think you and me are a lot alike in a lot of ways, and I think like you and me likely have some of the same flaws of our personalities and stuff like that, and just how we function. And I think that we need people like the people that we married. There are a lot of similarities. I'm thinking that, anytime I'm going through something medical, or anyone in my family is going through something medical, my wife is a nurse. And so she's always the one to kind of take the lead on that. And I couldn't help but thinking, when you were going through one of your therapy sessions where you were having to remove, I don't want to give too much away, but you were doing a menial task that was like, what is this really going to accomplish?
I had to get buttons out of a shoebox of rice.
There you go.
I was in a wheelchair, and my first therapy was find a button.
Exactly. And it's just like, in my mind, I'm like, man, when you told Nora about that, and then that was during lunch, and then later on that day, or maybe it was the next day, like you were doing a completely different therapy because Nora had went and had a conversation with some people, and I'm like, that is exactly what my wife would have done in that situation. So I couldn't help but kind of like put myself in the same environment as you and your wife during that time. But to see the amount of support and I think that, I think you need to give yourself a little bit of grace. I think that there are times in our lives where there are challenges that we run into that we don't have the ability to give our everything to somebody else, and there's give and take where you need to sometimes in your life take more than what you're able to give, as long as you're able to reciprocate that the other way around later on. So and I think that you realize that having gone through all of this, and I think that you probably live your life that way, where you try to give more than what you take from people.
Just in thinking about that question, I was brought up to be kind. I was brought up to work hard. In going back to Redux for a second, our philosophy really shifted into high gear when we decided to stop thinking of the work that we were doing as selling. We were advocating. We knew we had something that would allow people to hear better and live better lives. So that's not something you sell. We are advocating for patients. And, there's the people in the audiology field that recognize that. You recognize that. And I think it's I mentioned one of the reasons that brought us together. I've been very fortunate to carry that on. And it's almost, it's selfish because I enjoy doing it. But the concept of advocating for people, or giving a voice to people who don't have one, or even better, teaching people how to have a voice of their own, and some of the work that you're doing of helping other people create content, that's you advocating and helping other people to find a voice, and how can they start sharing best practices in a more widespread way. But you've been that way too, because I hope people know this, but it's easy to forget because they see you in videos in cool suits. But you served the military, and in pretty intense environment. You've lived a life of service, and so I'm just drawn to people that share that, because that's even way of, I could get pretty overcommittal about things, but I never did that. And
you almost did.
I did. I tried. You're right. I tried.
That's actually something that's really interesting, because, if you want to share that now, you can, but I have a similar story that actually went the opposite way for me compared to what it did for you, and I don't know if I've ever told you that story.
I haven't, but what you're getting at is it's probably best I didn't end up at West Point, because I mentioned before, if I being driven by things that would just make for a cool story to party. Yeah. Going to West Point and being graduating as a 23-year-old, 24-year-old second lieutenant with free college, and that makes for a pretty cool story. I could have told at parties for the rest of my life. That's not very forward thing. There's a 17-year-old brain. It's not really seeing the big picture.
Makes sense to me.
And I went through all of the many steps there are for West Point, and I failed the hearing test. And so that was the very first time I was told. I just thought I had bad hearing from being around lawnmowers and things. And in the 80s, kids' hearing protection wasn't even a thing. We got made fun of if you had worn a headset to a tractor pull or a 4-H event.
Yeah.
And ear ringing was a rite of passage. That's how I brought it, because it's
crazy to think about nowadays. Yeah.
And so the United States government told me my hearing wasn't good enough to serve in the Army. And I thought, what, I'm this like invincible feeling, 17, 18-year-old uber cocky guy, and the United States government says, no, you're not good enough for us to hand you a gun, and I thought that hit hard.
Yeah.
I ended up at Indiana and had a wonderful experience, and it was probably for the best. But
probably was.
So that the concept of service, the concept of advocating for others, and I'm not trying to make myself out to be a saint. I'm telling you, I do it for purely selfish motives. I enjoy doing it. So I don't know if that's a good quality or bad.
Probably I don't know, a little mix of both maybe. When I was reading that, I was like, this is unreal, because when I went into the Marine Corps, I was in boot camp and I failed the hearing test in boot camp. I have a hearing loss in my right ear. It's like a 2-frequency notch right in the middle of my audiogram that drops down to like 65 decibels and then comes back up into the normal range. And so I didn't even perceive anything other than the ringing, the tinnitus that I have in my right ear. The difference is that about 6 months, was it 6 months, not even 6 months, 5 months before I went to boot camp, 9/11 happened. Right. And so when I was in boot camp, they're like, do you want us to apply for a waiver? And I said yes. And so essentially we were at war at the time. And so I ended up serving out my entire 4-year enlistment. And at the very end of it, I asked them, when I was getting my medical records, when I was getting out, and I asked them, where's that waiver for my hearing loss? And they're like, oh, you didn't get a waiver. You should have been kicked out. So I should have been kicked out of the Marine Corps too. So a little bit different story for me. But honestly, I mean, the Marine Corps for me was probably for mostly selfish reasons as well, of me being able to say, hey, I'm a Marine, at parties and stuff like that, because that's just how 18-year-olds think, right? But I think for you, having read the book, obviously I'm casting my perspective on it, which is, I think that may have saved your life.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think of the journey that you had, and who knows, life works in mysterious ways. I don't know if you run into Nora, and I think Nora was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to you, and I think you would agree with me saying that. And it's just, it's crazy to think that where life takes us, it's almost like there's someone in control dictating it and making sure that you're where you need to be when you need to be there. And even though you don't have that cool story to tell about West Point, right?
Well, I think there's a two-way street there of like, people kind of putting the right things in front of you, but that doesn't happen if you just sit on the couch and wait for them.
That's true.
The notion of being open to doing things that make for cool stories at a party, there's a saying in there that something about people that the harder you work, the luckier you get.
Yeah.
And so yes, I have been incredibly lucky in life in terms of, Nora debating whether or not to go back to med school right around the time that she met me, and then being able to just crush all of my doctoral appointments for me. That certainly was there. Not being at West Point, instead having the wonderful experience I had at Indiana was one of them. But it was also a lot of trying to make my own luck.
Yeah.
And, I think that it's habit forming, and it's one of the things that in doing endurance events too, is you realize, like, hey, when you start getting into these positive habits, good things just start happening. And so there's been a lot of that, and I hope no one ever, I want to make this clear in all of the stuff we're talking about, and I hope I have, that I've had a life of privilege in many ways, and working, I don't know if you know this, but maybe being surrounded by some people that I respect that have doctorate degrees. I'm about halfway through my doctorate in public health, and it is more of me wanting to understand where can my experience fit on a more global scale in terms of helping create and influence systems that can help make sure people like me don't fall through the cracks, or people that don't look like me don't fall through the cracks. And how can we ensure people that are diagnosed with a rare disease have the kind of access I had? I mean, the average time with a rare disease for diagnosis, we're talking about diseases 1 in 50,000 type, is 4 years. You can imagine like parental frustration and insurance struggles. I got diagnosed with a 1 in 40,000 disease in 4 days.
Yeah.
And it cost me $10 total across all of them. Everybody should have that luxury. So if this raises some awareness for that, that's just one more way that I hope that it can make somebody's life just a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think that's well said. There's a couple other key themes in the book that I want to get into, and obviously the title of the book gives away part of it, right? I mean, you said how many songs were referenced?
128.
128. Yeah. So a majority of them I know, and if I'm being honest, I'm not necessarily a music buff. I mean, and there's this thing about me to where like even if I know the lyrics of the song, like I don't like hear the lyrics the right way.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. But you hear about using music therapy for dementia and music therapy for a lot of different things. Music was really big for you in terms of prior to you going completely deaf, and then on your recovery to where you actually were able to make sense of music. And there was one part in there where it was talking about there were songs that then you were able to hear and understand that you had not heard prior.
That's right.
So talk to me, were you always like super into music?
Not at all. I was in a trombone quartet, right? So 4 people in a quartet, and I was assigned the role of 5th trombone.
Wait, does that mean that you didn't actually play?
It means I played, but I wasn't talented enough to play the role of the 4th trombone in a quartet. We played, I haven't thought about this in a while, we played Silent Night in 7th or 8th grade, and I was at the end, and I played one note throughout the whole song, but there's one note on a trombone that you can either play in the first position or the farthest position. And so 2 of the guys that were in the quartet are now professional musicians.
No
one
kidding.
of them is a professional trombone player. He was at one end, but all of our middle school people that were listening to us play Silent Night didn't know which end was the best. They just knew my friend Tim was at one end and I was at the other, and the music sounded great, and I was the one that was constantly moving, so I must have been the better one. And it was just me playing one note over and over again in the role of 5th trombone in a Silent Night quartet.
Oh my gosh.
So it wasn't, but music was always just in the background. And so, when I even writing the book, I didn't sit down and think, how am I going to tie this into music? I thought it would be just some interconnected stories about my life that were maybe funny and maybe interesting and unique. And as I really started thinking about that, I went back and read the first several thousand pages that I had down, and I realized how many references I had made to music that I didn't even realize when I was writing them.
No kidding.
And I thought, there's certainly a weave here. And at the time I was listening to music as therapy, and so it was really this, my goodness, I've had this, there's a soundtrack to my life that I wasn't really even aware. Ahead of hearing loss, in the face of deafness, you start thinking about stuff that you want to hear, and there's, so I won't give away all of that, but the question of what songs do you want stuck in the head for the rest of your life is pretty heavy. What's your soundtrack? And I do get songs stuck in my head. Sometimes it's the theme song to Different Strokes. Sometimes.
Oh, great! Thanks for that, Matt.
So I started thinking, well, I want what songs are important to me at the time. But then you mentioned music therapy for dementia and things, and I just started meeting some mutual friends. Again, through Redux, I started meeting all of these hearing care professionals and learning a little bit about music. And I thought, why not start listening to some of those same songs again? And my theory was maybe I'll be able to pick up something there. I'm sure there's a much more complicated neuroscience explanation, but I started hearing better again when I started listening to music. And I was like, okay, well, I'm starting to hear those songs, but my wife and I were walking in Chicago one day, and she said, "What are you humming?" I'm like, "Oh, I don't know. I always hum." I got in the habit of humming when things would get really quiet, and I wouldn't know, did my hearing aid battery die?
Yeah.
Or is it really quiet? So total silence made me nervous. So if it was totally silent outside, the snow's just fallen, it's very quiet, I'm humming to get a little vibration in my ear to make sure at the time my hearing aid was still working. So I started humming, and when Nora and I were walking down the street, and she's like, well, this was years later, and she said, what are you humming? I'm like, I don't know. She's like, no, do it again. So I started humming again, and I had just watched a movie that won an Academy Award, and this song had been nominated for Best Song, an Academy Award, so it had been playing over and over again, and she stops and she goes, are you humming It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp by the 3 6 Mafia? And I'm like, maybe. And it was because now with my implant, I could see the movie, I could see the people singing it. There's a very distinct hook that they sing over and over again. I could hear it a little bit, and I could read it on caption. And so in working with some neuroscientists now, they talk about like trimodal, you're seeing it, you're hearing it, you're reading it, and that's how your brain really starts to jumpstart and learn and commit to things. And so the first song I've heard the first new song I've ever heard since probably 2000 was It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp by the 3 6 Mafia.
That's terrific. I think that's hilarious. So I think it's really cool. Like, and a lot of the songs I recognize, but you never really even think, and it's one of those things, again, like taken for granted. Like, I've heard all of these songs and never having to think, like, would I ever be able to even hear that again?
Yeah.
And music, it's so interesting because it's such an emotional interaction that we have, whether we realize that or not.
Yeah.
There's a lot of emotion that comes along with music. And even though I'm not a music buff, I can appreciate that aspect of it, and then I just find it very interesting how you're able to use that even consistently up through now for continued therapy.
Yeah.
We have a mutual friend, Dr. Angela Alexander, who does a lot with auditory processing disorder, a lot of auditory training. I went to a conference, actually a couple different conferences that she spoke at, and she actually referenced you. You told me nothing was off limits, so I'm gonna bring this up. She actually had played some of your pre-therapy and post-therapy sessions with her, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like you had some pretty dramatic improvements in terms of your auditory perception and speech understanding after going through her training.
So I met her. So a funny story about how I met her is there was a perception that hearing aids only got wet in the summer because of humidity. And I'll let the Redux guys talk about this more, but that's actually not the case. But at the time, there was that perception, and it was still new, and it was winter in Indiana. So I thought, I'm leading the sales and marketing team. I'll start calling people in Australia because it's summer there. And so you go to LinkedIn, and she had a pretty nice presence on LinkedIn, and so I scheduled time with her and talked to her, and she's like, well, I don't actually work with hearing aids, I work with auditory processing. And I said, I've never heard of that, I have no idea what that is. And she said, it's a lot more like how our brains hear. And I said, I'm not really familiar with that, but I have an auditory brainstem implant. She's like, you hear with an auditory brainstem implant, and you don't think you're familiar with how brains hear? And nobody had ever really explained, and the concept of brain hearing was not something that the hearing industry really talked about a lot. And so Angela said, I would like to spend some time with you. And I said, okay, on the condition that in the end you tell all your friends about Redux. So you'll probably notice in some of those videos there's a Redux sign behind me when I'm talking. And and to be clear to everybody, I'm not being paid by Redux to be here. They were just an important part of my life and allowed me to meet a lot of really great people. And the concept was, I was listening to sounds by osmosis for a decade. I just wore my implant and thought I would learn. And that kind of got me here. And then I started listening to music and some very specific lines of songs that I knew, and that got me to here. Angela said, let's focus on phonemes. And I said, okay, what's a phoneme? And so we're gonna even like word recognition. She said, no, we're gonna break down to S and T and M and N. And her theory was that by doing that we could kind of teach your brain how to hear some more specific things. And so I very clearly told her I'm on year 16 and with my implant, and at about 65% speech understanding, I already outperform any expectations that people had, and I've worked at this for a long time. I just don't want you to be disappointed if there's no impact. And so we did 20 hours of therapy, and each week she would say, and it was, point to point to the word that begins with t, say t, like really kind of connecting this brain loop of seeing, hearing the t sound. And we did that with every phoneme. And I remember the first time she tested me, I didn't get any of them because I'm deaf, and she's expecting me to hear over a speaker from Australia the difference between m and n. And I failed miserably, and I'm just concentrating so hard, and every sound sounds the same. And then 10 weeks later, she tested me again, and I'm concentrating so hard, and I'm frustrated because I'm not getting anything. And she's like, you went from, I'm making these numbers up, but from like 5% to 65%. And but one of the things that she did well is, and I think anybody that's ever had a hearing test in a booth realizes that's not the real world. Like there's no like sirens, there's no wind. So it's not the real world. So Angela would begin each session by asking, did you notice anything different today? And week after week, it's like, I'm sorry, no. I'm trying, but no. And one day, music pops up again, right? I'm listening to the same music. I listen over and over again, and I hear in the Beatles' Let It Be. I'm a big Beatles fan, and the line comes on that I'd always sung in my head, Mother Mary comforts me. That's not the line. It's Mother Mary comes to me. Yeah. And for the first time in 20 years, I distinctly heard the lyrics of a song differently in the exact same environment. And guess what phoneme we had worked on the day before? And so when Angela and I talked the next week, she's like, so did you hear anything different? And I was like, well. So she was very excited to hear that. And I picked up more and more. But it's almost like if you're trying to get a camera lens accurate, or sighting in a gun, or anything that like requires really detailed accuracy, you can get it pretty clear, and you're like, okay, I can see the image here, I know what's going on, and you might think that's good enough. And then somebody dials it even more, and you're like, oh man, I didn't know HD high def was even a thing. And so you keep stopping because you're like, this is so much better than it used to be. And Angela was just able to dial that in even tighter, where I'm able to hear Mother Mary comes to me versus comforts me. And those are pretty similar.
Yeah.
So again, it's a privilege of me being able to just, I happen to live outside of Riley Children's Hospital, who at the time was one of the best ABI and cochlear implant mappers in the world, mapper being programmer in the world. And then I went to Chicago, and Chicago has a voc rehab program that gave me some of the best hearing aids in the world. And then I'm at Redux, and I start meeting people like you and Jill Davis, and doing music therapy, and Angela doing auditory processing. I just had the right people at the right time, and the added bonuses there are just really cool.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I'll take that compliment for sure. But
I was talking mostly about Angela.
Yeah, I know that. I tried to loop myself in with those two. But no, but I think that's a really cool story. And you come up in just random conversation about, people who outperform what their expectations are. I mean, you were set up to expect not to do very well from the very beginning, and it's just kind of like you've blown through those barriers, and then why stop, right? Like just keep going and getting better and better. I do want to talk about this other thing that we have in common, which is Ironman Triathlon.
Yeah.
You and I don't know if you know this. Do you know when I did my Ironman Triathlon?
I don't know when, but before we go any further, can we not compare times?
We won't talk about times. We'll talk about times. No, you actually you rode a bike that didn't have the capability of being as fast as my bike, so I cheated compared to your time.
You didn't do yours on a tricycle with a flag?
Exactly.
Because of my vestibular balance problem, I had to get permission. And the Ironman Wisconsin declined because they thought riding a 35-pound steel tricycle
was unfair?
Was a potential competitive advantage.
Oh my gosh, you gotta be kidding me.
And so I was able to do it in Sandusky, but go ahead.
Golly. Yeah, that's crazy to me. I'm sorry.
Like
the aerodynamics and the weight.
Lance Armstrong's not climbing the Alps or the he's not winning yellow jerseys in a 35-pound recumbent
That's definitely not right.
reason.
That's definitely correct. So, I did my race, Louisville Ironman, in 2011.
Okay.
is when I did mine, and you did yours in 2011 as well, correct?
That's right.
So is literally, we would have been going through training at the exact same time, essentially. I was just in, where was I at the time? I was in St. Charles, Missouri doing my training.
Okay.
You were in Indiana doing your training at that time, I presume. But I want to actually go back to the inspiration for doing so. So a lot of people who choose to do physically challenging things, they're usually trying to either challenge themselves or overcome some challenge that they're having to say, hey, you know, that is almost my way that I'm going to show that I am at the top of my game and I can do anything, right? So can you kind of share with the people who are watching kind of what the inspiration was for you to do your triathlon?
If I knew which camera to look at, I would look at a camera and say, I was at a point in my life, and I think people can relate to this, is I really needed a win. And so going back to what can make a good story, but you don't undertake something like this just for a good story. I had lost a lot in my life leading up to that, you know, my ability to smile, blink, tear, walk in the dark, like everything. I could no longer water ski. I could no longer snow ski. I could not, just lost. I mean, yeah, okay, I was able to come through that, and that was great, but I could put a positive spin on it, and I wasn't walking around telling people, but yeah, here are all the things I can no longer do. I really just needed a win. And I didn't want a win. I could have done a 5K and that would have been a win. I wanted a win where people didn't say, good for you. The for you part was like, not for me. I wanted something that was just like, wow, like that's awesome.
That's amazing regardless.
Yes, that's amazing for you. I don't have a lot of regrets in life, but one is I told Nora I was going to do this, and in my mind this is a healthy, motivational, going to raise money for NF, research and awareness for NF, and it's a good thing. I was a little wrapped up in my own thinking there but I'm leaving her to essentially raise 3 kids by herself for a while. So I found a 36-week training program, and I looked at week 1, and I thought, I am in no way physically capable of doing week 1 of a 36-week training program. So I did a 10-week Olympic distance training program to get in good enough shape to start week 1 of the 36-week Ironman. So it was that 46-week program, and I will say, I mean, there's so much luck, and like with the weather and how everything works on race day. And the best training day I had in the entire process was race day. The best swim I had was race day. The best bike I had was race day. The best run. And so I'm very lucky there because it doesn't always happen that way. Some people do a great job training.
That's the way you plan it to be. That's the way you plan it to be, but you're right. It doesn't always happen that way.
Doesn't always work.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but that's great. I think that, and you're right. It's impressive to do and of course me coming at it as being an Ironman as well, like I think it's a very impressive feat to do. For me, getting into triathlon was you come out of the military with all this competitive, spirit and nature coming out of, wartime and all of that. And there's just this void of competition essentially. And so for me, doing triathlons, doing Ironman, I've done, I don't know how many triathlons since the Ironman, but it's essentially something that helps fill a void inside of my life. And I think that, whatever that thing is that you need to motivate yourself or look forward to, I think is a very powerful thing.
There are worse ways to channel that energy.
There are definitely worse ways, and unfortunately, we probably both know people who've channeled that energy in ways that were not beneficial to them or their families, right? But you're right. It's honestly, I often think of Ironman training as being more of a sacrifice of your family than it is for you, because they're the ones who are picking up the slack for lack of time that you have to spend with them, because it is so many hours. I remember at one of the peak training weeks, it was like 24 hours of training that I was putting in, and that's 24 hours away from doing things with your family and friends and work and all of that. And so it's a huge commitment.
24 hours of training, what people can forget, it requires like 10 extra hours of eating.
Yeah, eating and just prepping to go and start your hours of training, right? Yeah, so it really is it's another full-time job on top of the job that you have and family responsibilities too. So, let's talk about, I know we've talked about Redux already, but you pulled me aside at one of the conferences here, maybe a year or two back. I'm trying to figure out exactly which conference that was, but you personally pulled me aside and said, hey, Cliff, I'm going to be stepping down from my position at Redux, and I'm going to be moving into, advocacy, essentially. So can you kind of talk us through that process of transition?
So Redux was the best job I'd ever had in my life. Being able to work in hearing care and advocate for people with hearing care and have my experience losing my hearing and getting to know audiologists, to have that become valuable to somebody, because that's not a very valuable skill to very many people, but it is a super valuable skill when you're a hearing aid or a hearing care vendor, which is essentially what I was. Great product, great people. Around that time, the FDA approved the first ever treatment for certain types of NF. Not one that would help me, but I thought, this is what Nora did a marathon for. My family's been working for this for 20 years, back when this was a molecule being studied at the National Institute of Health. And now, because that's how long, pipeline is a slow process, and now this treatment is there, and they asked through kind of a series of conversations, they reached out and said, we really want somebody that can help us lead our advocacy efforts. We're a rare disease company, and in rare disease, it's incredibly important to have a really healthy working relationship with the community and with patient advocacy groups. And so essentially they offered me a job to do what I had been doing for free for 20 years. And I didn't even know that was a job. I didn't know you could get paid to be an advocate like that. And so what made it I remember telling the guys at Redux, and this is maybe I don't know if this made it easier or harder, every one of them said, you have to do that. Like, don't let us stand in the way of that. And I thought, it'd be easier to leave if you guys were like, no way, no way. Like, we need to find some contract loophole that makes Matt stay around. The other thing that made it easier to leave is knowing that they didn't need me. Like, we had gotten to a point where the people that work there now are at least as driven and committed, and certainly more informed than I ever was. So I felt like I was leaving it in a much better hands than my own, and certainly a better place than when I found it. I mean, you think about launching a product. You've seen people come up with new products all the time. This wasn't just a new product. It was a new product, a new brand, a new company, an entirely new category. Professional hearing instrument drawing was not a thing. So you can imagine the eye rolls, or people that thought this was just... I remember Bob Trainer in Colorado, and I went and met him, and he said the basement of my office when I retired was filled with the next best thing.
Yeah.
And that was 4 years ago that he told me that, and it stuck with me. Of there's so many next best things. So it was very important, and I would even say as patients and providers, that the trust and credibility to have in somebody, whether it's your own audiologist or in working with vendor, do you trust them? Do they have the credibility in what they do? Are they being transparent? And if not, why? Because maybe the goal is to be the next best thing and then move on. I really took a lot from being with a company that said there's nothing transactional about what we do. Then we could have sold you one and never talked to you again. Instead, we sold you one. We flew out here to see what it was like.
Yeah.
I find you at conferences. It was a joy to be a part of building something like that based on relationships. And I could not do the job that I have now. This isn't a rehearsed answer, so I want to make sure I say what I'm really thinking. I'm so lucky. I have the perfect job for me now of being able to help other people with rare disease use and share their voice across the entire medicine life cycle. I would not have the self-confidence to do that now had I not had the opportunity to work with hearing care professionals who help me recognize the value my experience brings. My hearing loss was the thing that put me in a corner for so long. I had companies that tolerated me. I had companies that I probably kept a job because they didn't know how to fire the deaf guy, right? I mean, like, I say that almost in jest, but I'm guessing it was probably like, what do we need to do to make sure that legally and compliantly we're okay? It wears on you after a while. And I think I expect people listening have probably had jobs where they were tolerated at best, and it wears on you. And then when I got to work in this industry and with the guys at Redux, it was like, I have value here. I have my unique experience. There's a larger lesson here in fit, right? That you find people that value what you bring to the table. And I didn't change. I was the exact same person. I just went from a room full of people that didn't give a darn about those experiences to people that said, that's why we hired you, because of that. And that was, that changed me as a person. I wouldn't have the confidence to do what I have now if it were not for this industry. So it's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. I was so excited that this all worked out, is I owe a lot to hearing care professionals. I mean, I can hear, I can outperform expectations. Yes, I did a lot of work. Yes, Nora was there for support, but I also had amazing technology. I had best practices. I had people that were willing to push the envelope. Researchers, clinicians, educators, all along the way that said, what can we do to help? And I wouldn't be here without that.
Well, I think that's terrific, and I truly hope we miss you inside of the hearing care world with Redux. But I think that what you're doing now, I think I have to agree with everyone at Redux, is that this is what you're meant to do. And with all that said, and we've spent a lot of time, probably more than the amount of time that you were willing to spend with me here today. But I would like you to share what you think needs to be said to someone with a rare disease or with NF2 specifically, who might be watching this being the only piece of content on my channel so far, but I can't remember seeing much content on NF2 anywhere. And this might be the only opportunity, not the only opportunity, but one of the key opportunities that you have to share what really needs to be said.
This book exists because it was what I needed when I was 23 and didn't know where to turn. I was alone. I wasn't alone, but I certainly felt alone because I found one guy, and he told me all the things I didn't want to hear. Whether it's with NF or whether it's severe hearing loss, you're not alone. There are support networks out there. It might take a little bit of work, but thankfully Google is better than Netscape Navigator. There are, for just about anything, regardless of how rare it is, there are advocacy groups out there that can probably help. And and multiple advocacy groups. So it's like anything else, you go to a club or whatever, or you join I don't mean like a club, I mean like if you join the Rotary or whatever, you might not, those might not be your people. And so you keep looking, but your people are out there because there's somebody somewhere feeling the exact same way you are. You guys are just kind of looking around for each other, and you're not going to find each other on your couch. Keep looking. And if people can think, all right, you know what, I do feel really alone in this, but maybe something in this story or maybe something in that guy's experience motivates me to go look again. Google what it is you're dealing with and add patient advocacy group at the end. There are networks out there that, and then advocate. There's a level of advocacy for yourself. There's a level of due diligence because you don't want to just go join the first circus that shows up because you never really know how credible it is. The work that you're doing. I know you're trying to add a level of credibility to the information that is out there. Find an organization that looks like it might be for you, and then do a little bit of research on the credibility of it, and I mean, the internet's a great thing. You can reach out to people from your home and say, what has been your experience? Or you can read reviews about it. I just, I feel like I could have moved my path forward by about a decade.
Yeah.
If I had had that book or somebody to tell me you're not alone, and here are some things that might make that journey a little bit easier.
Well, I think that book is going to change individuals' lives. I've already recommended it to numerous individuals. I'm going to make sure that every single individual on my staff reads that book, because I think that is a meaningful book, not just in the sense of dealing with a rare condition, but for anyone. Like I said at the very beginning of this talk, that there can be points taken away from that book that you don't have to even be dealing with any explicit challenges in your life right now, but it can help you, I think, handle challenges in the future better and reflect back on our lives and appreciate them more. So Matt, thank you so much for coming all the way out to Arizona to chat with me. I've really appreciated it. Now, one thing that I do as a tradition on the show, every guest who comes on gets their very own Dr. Cliff Show mug.
That's great.
So a little bit of a consolation of you having to spend so much time coming out here and then gifting me a book. I greatly appreciate it. And if I'm being honest, this is probably one of the most enjoyable shows that I've ever done. I think that your story is extremely compelling for everyone to hear, and I hope that literally everyone goes out and buys your book, and you did not pay me to say that. So.
I appreciate it. I sometimes you have conversations and you wonder, you're only asking me about the first page of the book. So I've been paying attention, and I'm like, he really read the whole thing?
Read the whole thing, man. It was very good. Thank you again for coming out. It's greatly appreciated. Excellent. Guys, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you hit that like button, and if you're not yet subscribed to the channel with notifications turned on, go ahead and do that as well, and we will see you next time.